Testing, testing. And we are away for round 4 of the HOSS Racing Championship, Tier 2 on the track at the moment. Good battle into turn 1 between Hamish and Jimmy. All on cold tyres, see what they can do. We have 2 off, the rest make it round the corner. Tim Horn taking the early lead in race 1. 7 lap race, 2 sprints and Enduro tonight. Paul R2 having a look up the inside. If he can get through here and get the car over for the next corner, he won't lose, no. Loses a spot to Tim Horn. Blair Gabbity's running away with it. Into the slight shortcut corner between the GP track and the short circuit as they come back onto the end of the GP track here. Hamish coming through again, just losing the rear. Bit of a pile up there. Dylan Dalrymple, Jimmy Carroll. Blair Gabbity stretching the lead out now, 1.8 seconds from Tim Horn. Luke in the Peugeot in 3rd place. Battle at the back between Hamish and Paul R2. Bit of a chicane coming up here to finish the lap, faster than the GP chicane. Tyres primarily just coming up to temp now to start their 2nd lap. Dalrymple from Jimmy Carroll. Lead staying about the same. Blair keeping about a 1.5 second lead over Tim Horn. It won't take much to make a mistake and lock a rear wheel. Status quo as we go on. Blair just losing a wee bit of time to Tim now. Let's see how both drivers go through the chicane, how much time they lose or gain. There won't work. Hamish getting the spot over Jimmy. Coming back from a little lock up in lap 1 on turn 1. Our pole sitter for the night was Hamish. Let's go on board with Dylan. Just trying to get it stopped for turn 1 and get it in. So he gains a position there as well. He's moving up into 4th place. Greg comes back. We'll run it through side by side. Blesh has the advantage. Hamish also advancing from the battle previous in the lap, gaining the spot and getting onto the back of Dylan Dalrymple. Dylan runs it wide. Blair Gabbity's pulling out a 2.5 second lead at the front from Tim. As we watch the battle here of Hamish, Jimmy, as they're going to go side by side through the chicane. Oh, Jimmy Carroll gets it under the side, spins out. Paul R2 coming through, gains the position. Allow Dylan to pull a wee bit out and get a bit of a breather going into turn 1 from Hamish. Blair Gabbity's out to a 4.5 second lead. Oh. Hamish locks Rez into turn 1. Loses a wee bit more time. Lap 4 of 7. Tim managing to take a bit of time out of Blair's lap this time, down to 2 seconds. May run out of laps though to try and catch up. As we go on board with Blair Gabbity's looking at the back. That's a 2 second gap to second place. Locks a bit of a wheel going through the chicane. Battles here. Dylan Dalrymple making his way up into 3rd place. Hamish tries to make the advantage there. Luke, the loser out of all of that, gets half turned around. So while sitting in 3rd, now back to 5th. Blair Gabbity's fastest lap of the race of a 34.5. Hamish fastest now on a 33. So he's catching back up. Bit of a lock up into turn 1. Dylan runs wide. Comes across on Hamish. Kind of status quo through here. Runs a bit wide. Give himself a bit of more wider of a corner. Takes a shallow line to get the exit through the next corner. He's going to look around the outside. Won't be a passing opportunity there. Tries to get the switch back, but Dylan's a hard one to get that one done. He's a fast racer. It's a battle for 3rd though. 2 Hondas, they both run wide, trying to get an advantage. Hamish gets up the inside. Oh, and they both run off. He does pay the driving standards observer, so we'll see what happens out of that one. So run through the chicane. Dylan losing a bit of a run onto the straight there, so he'll lose a bit of time. Could make it back up in the braking into turn 1. Gap at the front stays the same. 2 second lead for Blair Gabbity's over Tim Horn. Next race of the night will be a reverse good race, so couple laps left to go. Hamish locks the wheel and runs wide, but will be covered from the next corner. Bang it down the gears and turn it in. So right on board with Hamish. Trying to hold off Dylan as they come to the final stages of the race. Tidier through the corners that time than the last lap. Right on board through this next part, coolest part of the race. This is the chicane, a lot faster than if you run the GP circuit. Lock it in and bounce it over the ripple strips. Both of them quite tidy through there, so Dylan gains a bit of time into the last corner, keeps it nice and tight. And they go on to start the last lap of the race. Still about a 2-second lead for Blair. Oh, he spins it. And he'll lose it on the last lap to Tim Horn. Both Hondas running it wide. Driving stand observer not the best pleased about them running it that far off the track. A lot of time Blair lost in that spin. He's caught up. Hamish caught up. Bit of a shame, kept it tight the whole race. Tim Horn now with a 3-second lead. It's going to finish it off quite nicely. A few corners left to go. A couple of Hondas running wide in the background. We'll see if that ruins Hamish's run, if Dylan can get a run up into the last couple of corners. Not really a passing opportunity through the chicane. Tim Horn goes through, followed by Bear Gabbities. Hamish and Dylan. Dylan just about deep, losing a bit of time. As Tim Horn comes through to win race 1 in the Tier 2 class. Bear Gabbities second place. Hamish will come home in third and get the fastest lap of the race. Next race up tonight will be a reverse grid race, so Greg will start on pole, followed by Jimmy Carroll. Paul Artu will be third on the grid. A couple of Hondas spinning after the race. Bit of bumper cars. See what they can do through some traffic. Tim Horn, Blair Gabbities. They can make their way through to win the race. Back onto cold tyres. As the lights go out. Even start from everyone. Greg will lead them down into turn 1. See how many of them run it wide on cold tyres. On the outside of the track's not the place to be, you might get hit, but they all make it through there quite nice. Blair Gabbities running it wide in the background, trying to get a better run as they go 3 wide. Luke on the outside will be the loser out of all of that. Hamish trying to run around the outside, but doesn't work for him. Jimmy Carroll takes the lead. Dylan Dalrymple, good start. So we got Paul Artu spinning. Hamish and Blair Gabbities also spinning, so when they come together again, Paul Artu losing a lot of time, all 3 of those guys. Dylan Dalrymple's on the back of Jimmy Carroll. Luke Maver trying to go around the outside and get a bit of a run. Battle for third. Dylan have the pace. Who breaks first? Dylan thinks better of it, pulls it back in. Still a long way to go in the race, don't want to turn yourself around. As we go across the line, Jimmy Carroll holding off for the first lap from Dylan Dalrymple. Race 1 winner still in 5th place on the back of the field. There's a big go in turn 1. Gets a bit of a slide, loses a bit of time. We still have a run up the inside. Hold holds on. The Civic's going to try and get back under him. Has enough pace to hold on to. Both compromising runs through that corner. Allowing Tim Horn to get a bit of a run into this next follow-through corner. So Tim Horn will make advantage out of that into 4th place. Jimmy Carroll still leading the race from Dylan Dalrymple. Right on board here with Tim Horn in 4th place, trying to get to 3rd. Luke Maver having a good race in race 1, so he has the pace, so see if he can hold off Tim. Leah Gabbardy's Bollato and Hamish all at the back of the field after that lap 1 spin. Tim having a big look through the chicane, trying to get a bit of time, but there's really no way through there. So he comes onto the front straight, starting lap 3. Jimmy Carroll, fastest lap of the race again that lap, so holding off Dylan Dalrymple, who's a pretty fast competitor as well, so he'll be pretty happy with that after the race. Pulling out a bit of second lead. Tim Horn having a look into turn 1. Can't get it in there. Tim running it wide, trying to get a bit of a run, but still no way through. He's looking pretty racy here, but as he does it kind of over and under and see if he can get it up the inside for the next corner. And he will. They run side by side through the shortcut between the circuit. Bit of a bounce off each other. Tim's on the wrong side of the track for the next corner as he pulls back in. Try and get a run through this next corner to get a bit of a lead. And try and get in front before the chicane, but probably a bit far away, trying to use the draft down the back straight. These two battlings allowing Dylan and Jimmy Carroll to kind of pull away a wee bit. Go through the chicane, both running it real deep. Tim getting a bit of a run up the inside. Gets it up the inside into the last corner. Peugeot getting back to the inside. Trying to get a run up the inside for turn 1. Dylan right on the back of Jimmy now. Has a look. Thinks better of it. Oh, he locks the rears into turn 1, gets it sideways. Manages to put his foot down and hold on to it. It's a bit loud, Blair to have a look. Sorry, Luke, to have a look around the outside, but thinks better of it. Jimmy Carroll losing the lead now to Dylan Dalrymple. Jimmy's not coming unstuck with a half spin there. He'll drop down a few more spots because of it. Might have to have a look at what happened there after the race. Oh, a bit of a nose to tail. Luke having a half spin. Hitting the back of Tim Horn. Big lead now for Dylan. 4.7 seconds up the load. Like 4 of 7. See what Tim can do now with a bit of clear track in front of him. See if Jimmy Carroll can come back. So run it again real deep through here. Jimmy looking up the inside. No way through there. Dylan Dalrymple fastest lap of the race with a 34.4. Pollatu with a 33.9. But back in 7th place after that lap 1 spin. Hamish with a 33.4. Also only in 8th place after a lap 1 incident. Tim's not really pulling away from Luke here, so locks the rears and runs a bit wide. No real way past yet. Jimmy Carroll having a bit of a dive up the inside. Might have lost a bit of pace on that run though. Greg might have a look at him into this next set of corners. Tim just pulls out a wee bit of a gap there. This will be the battle for second place. Dalrymple pretty smooth operator when he comes into some clear air. Very hard to catch. As Tim runs wide, pulls it to the inside as he loses a bit of pace. It'll be interesting coming into the chicane. See what they can do. No real way through the chicane as a pass. Forsman did a mistake to run wide, but they all pretty straight through. Tim runs it to the inside to defend into the last corner. These two just glued together. They're not really pulling away. If either one of them gets in front of the other, they're showing they're about the same speed. Jimmy Carroll would like to be on the podium. Shows the nose into turn one. See what they can do under braking. Oh! Jimmy Carroll, Tim Horn come together. Luke's going to make the advantage out of that into second place. 7-second lead now for Dylan Dalrymple as Tim Horn has a look up the inside. Luke will run it round. He'll have the advantage to the next corner. Tim gets his nose in front. Gets a bit of a run now. Oh, we got a spinner in the background. Greg spins back down to 7th. Second to last lap of the race. So the battle continues for second place. Luke might have a run here. Bit of a faster entrance onto the straight. Wants to try and get at least beside him before they get to the chicane if there's no real way past other than just to keep your nose in there, but no. Single file through, no one runs it deep. Paul R2 back and forth place after that lap one spin, so managing just to put down some laps and come through the field. He's right on board with Luke as he has a look at him. Last lap of the race now. Tim Horn second place. Dylan Dalrymple just about a 9-second lead. Keeps it tight, tries to do the under and over. Tim Horn slows it down mid-corner, not ready for him to go. Bit of a correction there. So Luke's glued to the back bumper. See what he can do. This left right, loses a bit of time out of here, won't be able to have a run at him through the next bunch of corners. Paul R2 catching up to these guys battling. Dylan Dalrymple over a 9-second lead in front. See how these guys get onto the back straight, see if anyone can have a run. Pretty even. Luke might find it hard now, try and have a go through the chicane. It's not close enough. Oh, he tries. Just about hits the tyre barrier. Dylan Dalrymple goes through to get the win. Good battle between these two, but Tim Horn will prevail. We'll get a second and a first for the night. Luke coming home to finish off the podium. Paul R2 fourth. Blair Gabbity's what could have been comes back in fifth. Jimmy Carroll, race 2 leader for a while there, come home in 6th. And both Hamish and Greg after some lap 1 incidents. So we're doing some victory skids.
Oh, that one.
Terrible.
There wasn't much grip on the grass.
What happened the first lap? 2 people went off the first race, right at the start spot.
I think I got turn 1 correct about 40.
First race, first.
Probably just. Yeah. Yep.